Alright, so today we'll do the back of worksheet 2. Start with number 6. And for number 6, there's really like a few different ways we could do this. I found this one pretty hard. And trying to pick which side is more difficult. I mean, we could choose the right side. The left side we could factor to be a difference of squares, meaning, let's see, we could write it as 1 minus cotangent squared of x times 1 plus cotangent of x, cotangent squared of x. And cotangent, I remember, is cosine squared over sine squared. And if we get a common denominator, I can multiply this by sine squared over sine squared. Get a common denominator here, sine squared over sine squared. And we wind up with sine squared of x minus cosine squared of x over sine squared of x times sine squared of x plus cosine of x squared over sine squared of x. Well, this is really just 1. So we wind up getting sine squared of x minus cosine squared of x over sine to the 4th of x. And remember, sine to the 4th of x is the same thing as cosecant. So we could easily go from here to here. But one thing we could actually do is break this fraction up using algebra. So we could write this as sine squared of x over sine to the 4th of x minus cosine squared of x over sine to the 4th of x. 2 of these cancels with 2 of these. You have 1 over sine squared, which is just cosecant squared of x. And on the right side here, we want to, this is all sines. So instead of saying cosine squared, we could say that cosine squared is 1 minus sine squared and see what kind of happens. So we'll do 1 minus sine squared of x over sine to the 4th. And we get this. Cosine squared of x minus 1 over sine to the 4th. And then minus sine squared of x over sine to the 4th of x. This would be cosecant squared of x minus cosecant to the 4th of x minus, well, that's the same thing we had over here, where 2 of these cancels with 2 of these, and that would be minus cosecant squared of x. But because you're multiplying a negative, that turns into a plus, and you would get 2 cosine squared of x minus cosecant to the 4th of x. Now that one's really tough. I think that might be the hardest one, that we'll do in this whole section. There are a couple other ways to do it. Another way to do it, I think, showing you one that's a little bit easier. Every once in a while we talk about factoring, and right off the bat on the right side I could take out a cosine squared of x. And we get 2 minus cosine squared of x. Now, if you try to make the right side look like the left, we have to get cotangent. Well, there is a Pythagorean identity that says that sine squared plus cosine squared is 1. But also, if you look in your notes, if we divide everything by sine, we get 1 plus cotangent squared equals cosecant squared. So what I'm going to do is just make a substitution. Instead of cosecant squared, I'm going to write 1 plus cotangent squared. And I'm going to do the same thing with the second parenthesis. So 2 minus 1 plus cotangent squared. Let's simplify, and hopefully when we multiply this out, we'll get the left side. If we were to multiply this, we get 1 times 1 minus cotangent squared of x plus cotangent squared of x minus cotangent to the fourth of x. These cancel, and you do get the left side. So this one's a little bit easier. I mean, on your test, you're not going to have one at that difficulty level. All right, so let's move on to number 7. Problem number 7, it says we have secant of x minus 1 over secant of x plus 1 plus cosine of x minus 1 over cosine of x plus 1 is equal to 0. So let's get a common denominator. Looks like the least common denominator would be secant of x plus 1 times cosine of x plus 1. So I'm going to get that for each fraction. So what that means is I'm going to have to multiply the left by cosine of x plus 1 over cosine of x plus 1. And the right I'm going to have to multiply by secant of x plus 1 over secant of x plus 1. So it's a lot of work, but let's see what happens. And remember, it's supposed to equal 0. So what makes a fraction equal 0? If the top is equal to 0. So let's see what the top turns into. I'm just going to go ahead and FOIL everything. And this cosine cancels with this cosine. This secant cancels with this secant. On top, secant's really just 1 over cosine. This just turns into 1. This just turns into 1. And it looks like the top is just going to be 0. 0 over anything is 0, which is what we wanted. So just be careful. I mean, there's very little pre-calculus here. I mean, what do? Converted secant to 1 over cosine, but everything else is just algebra. And 0 is what we wanted because that's what the other side was. For problem number 8, it's cosine of x over 1 plus the sine of x plus cosine of x over 1 minus the sine of x, and that's equal to 2 secant of x. Now let's get a common denominator. 1 minus sine over 1 minus sine. This would be 1 plus sine over 1 plus sine. And let's see what happens. So cosine times 1 minus sine of x plus cosine times 1 plus sine of x all over 1 plus sine times 1 minus sine. Okay, so let's go ahead and distribute. On top we'll get cosine of x minus sine of x plus cosine of x plus sine cosine of x. And in the denominator we'll get 1 minus sine of x plus sine of x minus sine squared of x. So up top it looks like we're going to have 2 cosine of x minus sine of x plus sine x cosine of x. And in the denominator we're going to have 1 minus sine squared of x. Alright, let me just make sure everything's good here. Cosine times 1 minus sine. Cosine. This should be minus sine cosine, actually. Just make that adjustment. Alright, so just double checking that we distributed everything correctly. These cosines cancel. Actually, sorry guys. Cosine plus cosine is 2 cosine of x. These actual sine x, cosine x's cancel. That's what I meant. And we wind up with 2 cosine of x over 1 minus sine squared of x. And we got kind of stuck. So what are we supposed to get? We're supposed to get 2 secant. Secant is 1 over cosine, right? So somehow we have to get cosine on the bottom. So if sine squared plus cosine squared is 1, that means 1 minus the sine squared is cosine squared. This would cancel with one of these. And 2 over cosine is the same thing as 2 times 1 over cosine, which is 2 secant, which is what we wanted. That's the same thing as on the right. Alright, so a lesson with this problem, just make sure you're careful when you're distributing, right? Just basic stuff. Make sure you don't make any careless mistakes. For problem number 9, we have 1 plus the secant squared of x, sine squared of x, is equal to secant squared of x. So let's go ahead and convert to sines and cosines. This is going to be 1 plus sine squared over cosine squared. We get a common denominator. And we get cosine squared plus sine squared of x all over cosine squared. Well, this is just 1. 1 over cosine squared is secant squared. Alright, so now we'll just do the bottom. It says find one numerical value, find a numerical value of one trig function for each x. So for problem number 10, we have 1 minus the sine squared of x equals 1/9. Well, I remember that sine squared plus cosine squared is 1, so 1 minus the sine squared is cosine squared. If cosine squared is 1/9, that means that cosine of x, if you take the square root of everything, would be 1/3, and the cosine of x would be plus or minus 1/3. For number 11, we have 1 plus the tangent squared of x is equal to sine squared of x plus 1 over the secant squared of x. Well, let's see what we could do with this. I know that, what's 1 over secant? I mean, that's just cosine squared, right? Sine squared plus cosine squared is just 1. We could subtract 1 on both sides, and we just get tangent squared is equal to 1, where the absolute value of tangent is equal to 1. So tangent would be plus or minus 1. All right. So you could do it like that. I think on my answer sheet, I'm just taking a look to see what I did. I did it another way. I saw that 1 plus the tangent squared of x, that's a Pythagorean identity. This is actually just secant squared of x. So another answer that's just as well would be secant of x would be plus or minus 1. So I mean, you could do this a couple different ways. These answers are exactly the same. We'll finish with number 12. For number 12, it says cosine of x times tangent of x over cosecant of x is equal to 1/9. Well, cosine of x, tangent is just sine over cosine. So that means the cosines are going to cancel. And really what you end up with is sine divided by 1 over sine is equal to 1/9, which would be sine of x times sine of x, which is sine squared of x. And we go to take the square root just like before. We get that sine of x would equal plus or minus 1/3. All right, so that takes care of the back of worksheet 2. Have a nice day.